Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this tour around the history of Highbury and Islington Station. Now, stations are all really about people. And before we start, I wanted to spend a minute to remember someone who was probably one of Highbury and Islington's longest ever tenants. Harren Batt and his father Lalit both succumbed to COVID in the last couple of weeks, the son just 6 days after his father. Mr. Batt ran the newsagents on the station forecourt for the last 35 years. Lots of you will have known him because he was a pretty big part of this community. He was always friendly and very funny. I once quite unexpectedly appeared in Private Eye and he laughed at me pretty much for the following 10 years. And I know many other Highbury and Islington locals will have had similar experiences. He counted as his customers at least 2 neighbours who went on to become Prime Minister, a leader of the opposition and a number of leaders of Islington Council. Mr. Batt was totally on the button with local politics and local politicians too. Around here we've lost so many people to COVID and Mr. Batt leaves a huge hole in the communities of Highbury and of Islington. I hope that both father and son rest in peace and our sincere condolences to the Batt family. So here it is. Today, Highbury and Islington Station. Blink and you'd miss it altogether. And frankly, today's building is so poor that missing it wouldn't be a bad thing, except that, well, it's a major transport interchange and right at the heart of one of London's most vibrant and historic communities. There's a lot of sky at this picture, and as we'll see, it wasn't always so. I'm Richard Price, and I'm hosting this evening's session on behalf of the Rebuild Highbury campaign. The campaign was founded by Neil Bowdler about 10 years ago. It's been looking at different ways to, well, at least to restore some of the look and feel of the 1870s station. Neil made lots of progress in thinking about how this could be done, engaging TfL, who run the building, and Network Rail, who own the land, and enlisting the support of Richard Watts, the leader of Islington Council. But there are major engineering challenges, as which we'll come on to later, which make actual reconstruction hugely costly and very difficult. So for now, in lieu of actual reconstruction and to raise awareness of what's missing, the campaign has commissioned a new illustration, lifting the station out of the grey and grainy photographs that have come to represent it in our collective memory since its demolition in 1967 and 68. The new illustration by Jane Smith helps change all of that and brings this old Islington icon back to life in its glorious original colours. And that's what we're launching tonight, and we'll have copies of the illustration to order if you want to. We're also hoping to produce a booklet on the station's history in the next few months. So let me introduce my fellow panellists for this evening. Mike Ashworth is the former curator at the London Transport Museum, and then had the very challenging job until retirement of being heritage manager for TfL. So he was responsible for bringing heritage to the fore on one of the world's busiest operational urban transport networks. It's one thing to run a museum, it's quite another to manage heritage on a live operational public transport network. Jane Smith is an illustrator based just up the North London line from here in Dalston, and she specialises in urban buildings and landscapes, and she's the artist behind the new illustration of Highbury and Islington. We're also joined from Australia by Jann Burrows. Jann is a researcher on the life and legacy of Edwin Henry Horne, the 1870s station's architect, and she's also his great-great-niece. Unfortunately, though, Jann isn't well enough to present this evening, so later on I'm going to present her research on the architect for her. Here's a rough running order. We'll run through the history of the station and the railway, then Jane and I will take a look at the print, and then after that, I'll present Jann's work on Edwin Henry Horne with its many twists and turns, and then Mike will reveal all kinds of things about the missteps and plots and plans that explain a lot about why we have the station we know and love. Well, I'm not sure we love it. Anyway, the station that we know today. So let's come on to the history of the station. I'd like to thank Jim O'Connor of the North London Railway Historical Society for his help and research on the station. And also on the people who designed it and built it. This talk uses a lot of Jim's material, as well as other sources which we'll list on the website. In fact, the current issue of the Society's journal includes an article by Jim on Highbury and Islington, with photographs which we've really found incredibly helpful in the putting together of the illustration. I should also mention that debt that we owe the late Peter Bloomfield, who passed away in 2019 and was a driving force behind the society, inspired principally by his childhood memories of Highbury and Islington. The real start was the passing of the East and West India Docks and Birmingham Junction Railway Act in 1846, getting parliamentary approval to make a railway from near the Blackwall basin of the West India Docks to at or near Camden Town Station of the London and Birmingham Railway. Now, for its investors, this was the real point. They can make money by providing a connection from the new mainline railways through North and East London and into the docks. The railway served several docks, but even built its own, and this is Poplar Docks, the North London Railway's own docks, in the picture. So the railway was primarily intended for freight, and as those of us who live along the railway know, it's still a busy freight railway today. Much of its traffic going to and from today's main container ports to the east outside London. So there were originally no plans to carry passengers, and it came as a bit of an unexpected bonus when the small London and Blackwall Railway, which was an ambitious passenger railway, entered an agreement to run passenger services from Camden to its terminus at Fenchurch Street. And that's why our station opened on the 26th of September 1850, when it was named simply Islington. It was the temporary terminus for the service to and from Fenchurch Street, in the red box there, until the line was extended to Camden Town, now known as Camden Road, over 2 months later on the 7th of December. Soon the NLR was paying the London and Blackwall Railway to run its own passenger trains to Fenchurch Street, which is, as you can see, quite a circuitous route to get to the city. At this stage, the railway gloried in the name the East and West India Docks and Birmingham Junction Railway, and this was barely abbreviated to E&W, ID and BJR. Now, finding this all rather burdensome, in 1853, the E&W, ID and BJR took on the less cumbersome and much more appropriate title of the North London Railway. Renaming didn't stop there. Our station was renamed on the 1st of June 1864, and taking the slightly unusual and rather indecisive sounding name of Highbury or Islington. The following year, finally seized by the commercial opportunity of passengers, the NLR opened its city extension, shown in the orange box here, with a much more direct route and its own London terminus at Broad Street, which was a very serious and very substantial station in the city, right next door to Liverpool Street. Here's Broad Street in 1898, and here are its 8 platforms for passengers. This turned out to be a happy afterthought, because for many decades Broad Street was one of London's busiest terminal stations. Its success was such that a major expansion of the infrastructure was needed all along the line to cope with both freight and the extra passenger traffic. Most of the line was to be upgraded to 4 tracks, and this meant that extra platforms would be required. Plans were drawn up to rebuild all of the stations along the upgraded part of the line, and Highbury and Islington was to be the centrepiece of the project. According to the minutes of the NLR Permanent Way and Estates Committee on August 1869, temporary facilities had to be erected to enable the work to proceed, and these were to be built in as cheap a manner as possible. But little expense was spared on the permanent replacements. Having woken up a bit late to the profitability of passenger traffic, the company set out to attract new customers and to make its mark on North London in a pretty spectacular way. The company engineer, Thomas Matthews, normally handled the design of stations, but he was extremely busy with quadrupling the track and expanding the infrastructure. So the North London Railway employed the services of architect Edwin Henry Horne. Edwin designed Islington along with 5 other stations, and his buildings are rightly regarded as the best to be constructed on the NLR. Highbury or Islington, which was to incorporate the adjoining Cock Tavern, was possibly the most impressive and was sanctioned on the 3rd of May 1871, when a tender was awarded to the Bow firm of Messrs. Wicks, Bangs and Company, who agreed to carry out the work for £17,000, which, allowing for inflation, is about £2 million today. And that tells you a lot about the way construction prices have risen since then. So in June 1872, the company agreed to build shops on the railway's land adjoining and opposite the station, which were again to be designed by Edwin Henry Horne, and according to their minutes, built to a design uniform with the station building. And as you can see here, that's just what they did. A month later, on the 1st of July 1872, the station received its present name, Highbury and Islington. Work continued for around a year, and in April 1872, the Illustrated London News included this lovely engraving of the new frontage with a commentary that read, "The building consists of 3 wings, one of which is the Cock Tavern, the centre is the railway station, and the third part is a block of shops. The architecture is of an Italian character, freely treated, white Suffolk bricks being used for the face and Portland stone and terracotta for the dressing. Some pains have been taken with Some pains have been taken with the design and arrangements, and the convenience of passengers has been studied in a manner that does the company great credit." Edwin Henry Horne was for a while the toast of London. His Italian stations were regarded as really the cutting edge of public transport technology and provision, and as an important recognition of this achievement, a model of Highbury and Islington was showcased in the architecture room of the 1872 Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, and there it is. This is in the little RA booklet that you get for deciphering the numbers, and it's exhibit 1175. So, it's quite a place, Highbury Corner. We have this beautiful station complex with its courtyard, flanked by 2 blocks in a similar style, giving Highbury Corner a real sense of place and grandeur, as well as being very busy and a real thriving hub at the centre of the community. I really like this photo which is taken from Highbury Fields, and it gives an idea of just what a local landmark Highbury and Islington station was, with its 4 turrets, making it an icon on the North London skyline, just as much as Union Chapel is now. Edwin was also responsible for a shop on the other side of the road, as this is still on railway-owned land. The beautiful and elaborate coal office, Thomas Lee, opposite the station, was his too. And just after 1810, the railway built a little row of shops on the courtyard in front of the facade, spoiling the effect a bit, but making, I guess, good commercial use of the space. The elaborate and comfortable and reassuring style of the NLR stations paid off, as the railway had intended. And for the next 3 or 4 decades, traffic and profitability grew markedly, not least with the growth of North London's Victorian inner suburbs, and notably, of course, Highbury itself. But as with all things that are highly profitable, a disruptor came along. Well, 2 really. First of all, electric trams emerged rapidly in North London in the 1900s, giving a comfortable and cheaper alternative route to the city, although the streets were still pretty congested. We should probably insert a joke here about Highbury Corner, but look, let's not. And then in 1904, the tube arrived just across the road from the NLR station. And this wasn't any old tube. This was the Great Northern and City Railway's big tube, which ran mainline-sized trains from Finsbury Park via Highbury and Islington and into Moorgate in the city, providing a much more direct and faster and pretty comfortable route into the city. And this began to eat into the NLR's passenger base. The NLR responded, as in this advert, by boasting of the benefits of travelling through London's noted fresh open air, which was quite a claim in the 1900s. Here's their slogan: why travel under the ground when you can choose the open air route? And this approach wasn't entirely convincing. So in 1916, the London and North Western Railway, which later acquired the NLR, took the decisive step of upgrading the line and electrifying it, with new trains which offered better acceleration and comfort, and had an altogether more modern feel. And it worked. The NLR won back some of its lost customers and largely sustained its passenger numbers up to the Second World War decades later. Now, as with so many of London's urban landscape, it was the Second World War that really changed things for Highbury and Islington and for its immediate neighbourhood. Edwin's masterpiece was very badly damaged. It was bombed, we think, on 3 occasions and twice with really serious consequences. First, on the 14th of October 1940, an incendiary bomb fell and set fire to the mansard roof, destroying it and the entire top floor of the building, the remains of which were later removed to make the building safe. And then much later in the war, on the 27th of June 1944, a V1 Doodlebug flying bomb's engine cut out randomly, as they always did, probably somewhere over Dalston or Canonbury, and then made a steep descent, finally hitting the post office at Highbury Corner at 12:46, just as many people were out for their lunch, killing 26 of them and horribly injuring a further 150. This is a bomb damage map showing in purple the buildings which were entirely wrecked by the blast. And you can see the railway going through there with Highbury and Islington Station just to the left of Holloway Road there. And then it shows in red, or sort of pinky red, those which needed to be demolished. Most of the block, as you can see, around the post office and the Westminster Bank at Highbury Corner was entirely destroyed, as well as parts of Canonbury Road and Compton Terrace, leaving the empty space which became the Highbury Corner roundabout and more recently Highbury Corner Square. And this is what Highbury Corner looked like just after the war. The station complex itself suffered very serious damage. The Cock Tavern faced onto the post office on the other side of Upper Street, and as you can see, the wing facing onto Upper Street was destroyed, along with the pub's upper stories opposite Highbury Place. The main station block suffered further serious damage, and you can see that the top floor, which had been removed in 1940, and now the 2 western turrets were also destroyed in the 1944 blast. The little row of shops is also a ruin, caught in the blast. After the war, there was no money to invest in improvements, and the station continued in a pretty dilapidated state until the 1960s. The 1870s building on the island platform was demolished and replaced in about 1956 by a new modern canopy, which you can see here. The disused building, which served the unelectrified line, lasted in a derelict state for many years, but went in the late 1960s. And here's a final view from 1967. The famous Cock pub has been demolished and rebuilt. The row of shops has been replaced by the famous temporary post office, which sat on the forecourt for half a century. Edwin's wing of shops is being readied, you can see, for demolition, and the station block itself has had its surviving turrets removed for safety, although curiously somebody's thought to preserve the blank clock face. What happens to Edwin Henry Horne's fine building itself, we'll cover in a little bit in Jann's talk, and then later Mike will talk us through a real sort of what happened next and who done it story involving, I should, just as a spoiler alert, the arrival of the Victoria line. And in the new illustration, we have been trying to bring this back to life a bit. I'm not quite sure what to do now, Jane. Shall I turn the video?
If you could put, maybe if you put the illustration up.
Anything can happen now. Can you see? I'm assuming people can
see you in the bottom corner.
Okay, if you turn yours on, then people will be able to see.
Mine still won't go on. It's still disabled.
It won't go on. All right.
But the voice will do it.
Anyway, so hopefully people can see Well, I don't know if you want to see
I
one or
can
not.
see you in the kitchen, as long as they can hear.
Yeah, fine. So look, I mean, this is what we started with, really. This picture has been hanging on my wall just outside where I'm speaking from for ages, and it's just, you look at it and you think, well, you're going to Highbury and Islington every day, and you look at that and you think, crikey, what happened there? And we've had, and of course there are lots of these, of varying quality, grainy photographs of the building. And Jane, I mean, it's been a bit of a labour of love to try to bring this back to life, hasn't it? I mean, how did you find it in terms of, reconstructing it?
I enjoyed it. I mean, the way I am, I tend to really get into things, so I really, really went for it, and tried to put in as much detail as I could within the physical space, as it were.
Yeah.
Partly made me sad, the fact that it wasn't there.
Yeah.
But it was a really nice thing to do, and to feel part of trying to bring it back to life. And I especially enjoyed all the little details, like the metalwork on the what do you call it, above the clock,
yes, I mean, I've been learning all sorts of terms. That's filigree ironwork, I think.
The filigree ironwork on the turrets.
I should say, I mean, thanks to all the people that have helped with this. It's been a real labour of love for you and me, Jane, but also for a lot of other people that, particularly people like Barry Page, who has been tremendously helpful with this, and a few people like him who can remember the station and just about remember the details and help with the colorings, and and it's really important to capture, I think, in the illustration, the things that people remember about the station that kind of make it real. And I've mentioned Jim Connor as well, who's put in a whole series of comments and suggestions on the picture. Let me hang on. I'm going to try and there you go. So that's
there we go. We've got it up.
That's the full illustration.
I mean, I quite like making repetitive images, so it was quite nice to be able to duplicate the doors and the windows in a row, that sort of thing. And also adding the texture, which the texture was actually made from a bit of scanning in a sort of rough texture of some lino ink that I had, and then making a huge sheet of it and then using it to drag and drop into the image. And then in Photoshop I made the opacity less so that you can just see a hint of it rather than it being too strong.
Yeah, so I think that's worked really well. It sort of captures the sense of brickwork.
Yeah, it can just work to make images a bit less stark and give it more friendliness somehow. Actually,
there's one thing we should have explained. People be wondering about all sorts of details here. So, I mean, the original idea was to pretend that the station had survived, wasn't it? And that we were trying to get at what it would look like now if it had survived intact through the war through the 60s, and then the sort of fantasy was it had been restored as part of the Overground project about a decade ago. So we do have another version, which I'll try and bring up in a second, which shows the station as it would have been, a bit more faithfully as it would have been in 1910 rather than 2010. But we've taken a few liberties with this. I think you can see here I mean, those clock faces remain blank for the entire lifetime of the station, but we thought it would be quite fun to just add in the famous Highbury clock.
Yes.
Well, I suspect will irk the purists, but look, it's Highbury, so why not?
Exactly.
And we spent ages kind of squinting over the lettering, the detailing, the facade. I think we got to the point where we were quite keen. I mean, you'd want to sort of go into that nice-looking Italian restaurant and Barboni's, which I think was there in. Was it 1910? I think we spotted that.
Edwardian sort of times, wasn't it? Yeah,
and then the Cock Tavern here, which just looks a lot nicer than the modern one, I think. And the little things like that street sign. Some of you aficionados will recognise as being the street sign that's still there, because it's quite a distinctive one. But and actually you can see here just below the beginnings of the blue awning to the right, the sort of modern blue awning. That twin pillar there, and the bit above it, roughly up to the height of that window, is all that's left. So there's we'll see later, I think, the the solitary, sort of rather lonesome remains of the only bit that remains, which is literally that pillar there. So basically, Jane, you've managed to recreate the whole thing. I think it's what they call respawn it. The young people call it respawning these days.
I was thinking it's like
able to do
a bit of the building's DNA, isn't it? You can use that
exactly. Well, there's a lot. I tell you, there's a lot in that small fragment, isn't there?
Yeah, a lot of information there.
So there's our clock, more filigree ironwork at the top there. Oh my gosh, I mean that took some doing.
Well, I do have the help of various Photoshop tools where you can duplicate areas. So, for example, the upside down heart shapes in the filigree. Yes. I did half of one, and then duplicated it to make it into one, and then duplicated it again to make it into two. Yeah. Which is fine when something's straight on, but when it's at an angle, then it becomes, like on the sides. That becomes a little bit more complicated.
I mean, it was just some of the pictures that we, just the sort of ludicrous guesswork that we had to try to do to work out, how many of these doors there were and windows and how they matched.
And the size of the lights.
Colouring was really difficult, wasn't it? Because, I mean, all these, the few colour photographs just sort of capture it at an age where everything was flipping covered in soot.
Yeah, I think the thing with so much London brick, you've got quite a few colours, haven't you, with London brick? Yeah. Is it Suffolk? What do you call it? Suffolk yellow
Suffolk brick, Suffolk white, sorry. So which is actually a sort of yellowy shade. See, this was one colour picture that we had to go on. But of course, it's not really a colour picture; it's been colorised. We were still plenty of guesswork with this. I mean, here's the pillar. This is all that remains of Highbury and Islington Station, sadly. But as you say, you can, some of the details, the acanthus leaves, the brickwork's very characteristic of Edwin Henry Horne. I mean, we'll see. You've used that to good effect, I think. I mean, here's a close up of it. This was really helpful as well, as I said before. The article by Jim Connor in the North London Railway Historical Society's latest journal, and actually, look, you can see there some of the roundels and more details of the acanthus leaf decoration. You've got some terracotta panels right up there at the top. Yeah, here, and so Jane, you've redrew all of these and tried to recreate it, and we're thinking of producing a booklet at some point, and these will be fantastic for decorating that.
I enjoyed doing those as well.
Yeah, I thought you did.
Yeah, I know, they're good fun. They're almost a bit like doing a textile design, or
you can see that.
I do have a strong sense of pattern. Yeah, so you can get carried away with it.
And just, I mean, in terms of colours, thank goodness, as we'll come on to, a couple of buildings have survived from Edwin Henry Horne on North London Railway, probably the best of which is Camden Road. So you get some sense of the colours from that. It's an early rough drawing. I probably shouldn't show that, should I?
Oh, you can show anything you like.
Okay. Here's
I haven't written anything rude on there.
Town again, or Camden Road. Here's Hackney Central, now Oslo, the nightclub. Thank God that's been preserved. It's not a station anymore, but I think Oslo are looking after it pretty well. Yeah. Right. So here is this is the 1910 version with which is pretty much as it would have looked in the Edwardian era before the shops were put in front of it. Look, just to finish this little bit off, I mean, the great news is that you can now own a piece of Highbury and Islington Station and put it on your wall at home. As we've produced these poster versions of Jane's work in the two versions. We're hoping to distribute these far and wide to raise awareness of the building and its potential, the potential for doing something with the site now. If you want to, you can order both or either version from eBay. They're £25 each for a lovely production of Jane's work. We will put up links on this later, but basically you can link from the website or just search on Highbury and Islington in eBay, and I think they're now live, so they should come up. And Jane, here we are. Right, to see more of Jane's work, these are Jane's details, and you can also follow her on social media or visit her own shop.
Thank you. I mean,
great work here on urban landscaping and you know, the sort of cityscape, and you know, I think it's fantastic. Which is
maybe it could be copied into the chat or something.
Yeah, we can try to do that.
Brilliant.
Can you do that? Because I'm not sure how to do it, honestly. I'll lose my screen but I will try and do that later in any case.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you so much for your work on this. It's been fantastic.
I've really enjoyed it. I really have.
Great. Well, likewise. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's come on to Jann's research on her great-great-uncle, Edwin Henry Horne. Now, as I said, I'll be presenting this evening as Jann is unwell. She did, however, send us a message, which is the technology work, so I'll now play for you. It's not going to work, is it? Heck. Oh, that's a shame. I can tell you what she said. What she said was she's very supportive of the idea of rebuilding Highbury and Islington, and is very grateful for all the support that you know, everyone in the campaign and on this session tonight is showing for doing that. So, Jann, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I don't know why that thing isn't working. Anyway, we might try and make it work by the end of the session this evening. So let's. Edwin Henry Horne was, I should have said actually, sorry, I mean, Jann's done a huge amount of research on Edwin Henry Horne. He, both on his life and I think what she's done has made a real difference to the way his buildings are now being regarded and safeguarded, among other places in Hackney's conservation area process. This is his signature, so it's slightly blurred. Edwin was one of 13 children, born in 1843 at Munster Street in Regent's Park. Now, for a small boy with a household of 13, probably just getting his hands on a pencil and paper must have been a bit of a challenge, but he was soon to make a crucial move. The census for 1851 finds him aged 7 as a pupil in a small private school in Holloway, where his brother and cousin were also enrolled, and the head teacher was married to his aunt. So this is like a home from home, where the head specialised in mathematics and classics, and it was an ideal start for a future architect. From Holloway, he went on to Totteridge Park School, where local newspaper reports of the speech day show him winning prizes for writing and for drawing. And he was also returned to the school later to play cricket. The census of 1861 finds him living aged 17 at home at Adelaide Street in Hampstead, and he's listed by that time as a civil engineering pupil. He'd been articled the previous year to the engineer and architect George Roden Burnell. In 1860, in addition to his training with Burnell, he became a member of the Architectural Association, which had been founded in 1847 by two basically dissatisfied young architects, Robert Kerr and Charles Gray, to provide a self-directed, independent education at a time when the profession of architecture had really yet to appear in the form recognised today. And the Architectural Association school is still sort of one of the sort of elite architectural schools around the world. This was its headquarters at the time in Conduit Street, Mayfair, and in the 1860s, Edwin would have been making his way here pretty regularly to attend lectures and social functions. The students of the AA were addressed by lots of eminent figures, including John Ruskin and George Gilbert Scott, and as I say, the association grew into a sort of very prestigious international organisation. From 1865 to 67, Robert Edis was the president of the association, and Edis is a sort of interesting connection because he was at the time employed by the North London Railway as architect for their refreshment rooms at Broad Street Station. And we don't have any recorded proof of this, but it's reasonable to think that Edis may have played an instrumental role in Edwin's joining the NLR, which he did in 1865. A move which played such an important role in his life. So Edis and his colleague Edward W. Goodwin were, mixing with some of the great names of the era, really, and this was the kind of circle that Edwin was moving in. Godwin lived for many years with the famous actress Ellen Terry, and they had 2 children together. The pair were friendly with the pre-Raphaelite painters Millet and Rossetti, Ellen Terry later went on to marry the artist George Frederick Watts. Edith designed a house in Chelsea for Whistler, and Godwin designed another one for Oscar Wilde. Now, without any letters or diaries to turn to, we don't really know, we can't put our fingers on anything of the specifics of Edwin's social life in London. But these were pretty exciting times, and as a budding and talented young architect, being exposed firsthand to the ideas of men like Ruskin, he was on the fringes of a pretty heady world. So early in 1865, at the age of 23, Edwin completed his 5 years training with Roden Burnell, and he was engaged by the North London Railway here at their headquarters in Broad Street, which was brand new at the time.
Wow.
He was engaged to work on surveys and as an architect for the planned new stations on the line, and he was, as I say, based here at Broad Street. Now, the brief that he was given appears to have been to develop the NLR's house style, which is pretty evident in earlier stations on the line. And it was a brief that he carried out with notable success, replacing the existing wooden buildings with stations of handsome and commodious character, as the Illustrated London News said, culminating in the very impressive passenger station we've seen at Highbury and Islington, which drew much praise and attention. Edwin, slightly departing from Jann's conclusions here, but just to say, Edwin probably started work on the stations alongside the NLR's chief engineer, Thomas Matthews. And as we noted before, Matthews had overseen much of the building of the railway in this period, including earlier stations, and he really established the NLR house style of architecture, which Edwin very substantially enhanced and elaborated. This is actually, this is your local station, Jane. This is Dalston Junction.
It is. I remember.
I remember parts of that. It seems that Matthews and Horne worked together on a number of these earlier stations, and there are certainly strong traces of Edwin's distinctive touches to brickwork and terracotta designs, and lots of acanthus leaves there in the decor on the columns. And these are kind of embellishments that what's an otherwise pretty basic looking booking hall at Dalston Junction, which opened on the city extension in 1865, and that was really right at the start of Edwin's tenure with the NLR. Matthews and Horne share the credits, you can see here, for a much more substantial station and NLR Railway Workers Institute at Bow. Matthews as engineer and Horne as architect, you can see at the top there. But by 1869, Matthews was almost completely occupied with the expansion of the infrastructure through, it was a really difficult job because clearly, he was expanding the railway through a very densely populated part of North London. And Edwin, although slightly incredibly, he was only 27 years old, had proved himself sufficiently by that point to be trusted with the design of the 6 stations on the upgraded line. So this is a huge investment the NLR were putting in, and they put it on the shoulders of a 27-year-old, which seems remarkable by the standards of any time, really. So his style was described in the Illustrated London News as distinctive Venetian Gothic, not repeated elsewhere on the railways in England. He was doing some other work at this time as well. He was living in Primrose Hill, a nice, fresh, airy spot commanding a superb view of London and St. Paul's. This is around 1869, so a few years later. And we find him busy at work back to Dalston. Quite a lot of work in Dalston. This is his building for Reeves Paints, their 3-storey premises, which is now occupied by the Arcola Theatre, the brilliant Arcola Theatre. And then on NLR land, a lot of his work was on railway land for the NLR. He built 12 houses in Ashwin Street. I shall try to show you. Here you are. I mean, these have been, you can see they're sort of painted and incredibly dilapidated, but I think are now covered by a conservation area. So one hopes they are now being looked after properly. They were, I'm afraid, in the hands of Railtrack for some time, at which point things went terribly wrong for them. Also some shops in Dalston Lane, again on railway land, right at the heart of Dalston town centre, as well as this beauty, currently closed as a pub, but recently restored by Hackney Council, the Dalston Junction Railway Tavern. Now, at this point, Edwin had been with the North London Railway for some 4 years, and he'd almost certainly begun work on 5 of the 6 passenger stations that he designed for the company. This is a photograph of Bow. We saw the design earlier. Now, in the records of the Architectural Association, Edwin's address in 1870 is listed as the terminus at Broad Street Station. And his workload that year must have been incredible because, you know, quite apart from the buildings we've just had a look at, the first of his stations, this one at Bow, was to open in March 1870. And as I say, it's a big station with, on top of it, this big Railway Workers Institute. Let's just look at, if we're going to bring our map up, here we are. Let's just look at what Edwin was doing in terms of the map of the line. You know, as I say, at the age of 27, he was the architect responsible for those 6 brand new stations across North London, 2 of them very, very substantial buildings, a huge programme of investment, in addition to his earlier work on stations like Dalston Junction there in red, where he was essentially proving himself under the more experienced eye of Thomas Matthews as chief engineer. So the opening of Bow was then followed by Barnsbury, now Caledonian Road in Barnsbury, in November 1870. In the first week of December, 3 new stations opened. This is Hackney, later Hackney Central, and now Oslo. Then Canonbury. This is quite a late picture of Canonbury. Lots of studs covering that. Obviously, this is a 50s, 60s picture. You can see the filigree there, Jane. Just keep your eyes on. Nice. And there are more happily Camden Town, now renamed Camden Road to avoid confusion with the Underground station. In the London Standard of December the 6th, 1870, an article appeared reporting the opening of these later substantially built stations and stressing their importance for the comfort of the growing numbers of passengers using the line. Hackney and Camden Road are still standing, and there is a plaque. This is Camden Road, and the latter is a heritage listed building bearing a Transport Trust plaque naming its architect. And at Camden Road, you can see some of the direct influence of Edwin's Venetian sort of study of Venetian architecture. So, for example, the window patterns at Camden Road are pretty much direct copies of the otherwise fairly unique designs from 2 buildings in Venice. This is the 15th century Palazzo Corner Spinelli, and other detailing matches the 16th century Scuola Grande di San Rocco. Canonbury, well, not much is left of Canonbury, unfortunately, but the one thing that is left is the station master's house, which is still there. Which is still out this weekend when I took these pictures. On to Highbury. I mean, back at the start of 1871, with 5 of Edwin's stations completed and in operation, the way was now clear for work to continue apace on his most ambitious project, this big passenger station at Islington, and a real sort of showpiece for the NLR. George Gilbert Scott's St Pancras had just been opened in 1868 by the Midland Railway, and that set obviously the bar very high for young architects like Edwin. And as a member of the Architectural Association, he'd have heard the renowned Gilbert Scott speaking about Gothic revival architecture and the use of brick, which Edwin used to great effect in his stations and later, as we'll see, in his church. By November 1871, his designs were completed for the shop premises at Highbury, and tenders for building were invited. And throughout 1871, work continued on designs and construction for the station itself. And in late 1872, the renamed Highbury and Islington was opened with a scale and style, as Jann says, of a grand Italian palazzo. The architect was toasted at a celebratory banquet appropriately held in the Cock Tavern, which of course he just built on the left there, and it was reported in quite rightly in one of our favourite local newspapers, the Islington Gazette. On 19th of April 1873, that famous article appeared in the Illustrated London News with this engraving of the station and describing the building, as we noted earlier, as being of Italian character, freely treated, white Suffolk bricks being used for the face, Portland stone and red terracotta for the dressings. And Edwin's drawings, as we've seen, were exhibited in the prestigious summer exhibition at the Royal Academy late that year. So, let's have a look. Turning now to after Highbury and Islington. So in 1874, taking a break from railway work, Edwin was selected from a field of 12 architects to design and supervise the building of St. John's Church at Ealing. The Gothic architecture was described in the Annals of Ealing, there were Annals of Ealing, but apparently there are, as French Gothic. The interior is striking, they say. The proportions are good, the breadth and height are such as to distinguish it from ordinary 19th century churches, and there are several original features as the lofty and wide arches connecting the transepts with the nave, the half arches between the aisles and the transepts, which bring the whole into one vast auditorium. The use of the lower part of the tower to form a choir and the spacious lofty organ chamber is particularly impressive. In the minister's words, at the consecration in 1876, thanks to the genius of the architect, the faithfulness of the builders, and the generosity of the people, they could now boast a church that, unless there should be some disturbance of nature, would last many generations. I mean, it's almost tempting fate, isn't it? Would last many generations. The foundation stone bears Edwin's name. Edwin was admitted to Reba in 1875. Pointing to his career to that point, and his admission to Reba really meant he was joining the elite group of British architects at the time, and for whom great things could be expected. Instead, sometime around 1880, Edwin he simply disappears from the record books. He was just 37 and his career was pretty much over. There's no record of him in the English census for 1881. The last mention of his name on record at the Architectural Association was in 1880, the same year that he last appeared in the Post Office Directory of Businesses registered at Old Broad Street. His membership of Reba lapsed and they were trying to locate him. We had just one clue as to what happened. In a letter written by his brother Arthur in October 1885, these two sentences. Edwin gives me great trouble and anxiety, he says. It's a pity his sisters didn't keep him at home and try to pull him around, for he was a very clever fellow. So he's clearly very worried, and he leaves us in no doubt that his brilliant brother's career had ended. So, we have nothing really to go on until 2016, when this letter comes to light, written by Edwin himself. It's sent from France. It's dated November 1881, and it was addressed to the Secretary of Reba. He was living at the Route de Calais in Boulogne, and he explains that he'd been forced to go abroad because of ill health and money problems, naming his work on St Andrew's Wharf on the Thames and various other projects for which he hadn't been paid. He appeared in the 1881 census, the French 1881 census, where he's recorded as Henry Horne, ingénieur anglais. We suspect that Edwin may have suffered long-term from bronchial asthma, and he eventually died of bronchitis. And this severe bronchial asthma at that time would have been really incapacitating, making it hard to spend time on site and to meet deadlines. So this maybe explains some of the money problems. Treatments then available like laudanum just, frankly, would have raised more problems than they'd solved, or certainly additional problems. So we don't know where he spent the decade 1881 to 91. Maybe in Paris, maybe in the south of France, maybe in Italy. His interest in Venice is very clear from the Venetian influence we've seen in his buildings. So a move to Italy would make sense if he needed to live in a warmer climate. And something came to light just last year which suggested he probably did spend some time in Italy. This watercolour, sorry, that is a bit blurred actually on the screen. I hope you can see it all right. This is signed E.H. Horne. It was auctioned in Norfolk a few years ago, depicting gondolas on a canal. Jann bought it online from a dealer in 2019, hoping to find a date that might indicate whether it was painted in the 1880s or earlier, perhaps during his pupillage with George Redden Burnell when he was training. And it was customary for articled architecture pupils to travel abroad in their final year, so perhaps that's what he did. I mean, there's some evidence of travel on the continent from elsewhere. Oops. Here we are. There are lithographs based on Edwin's drawings held at the Wellcome Library in London. Among these, from the 1860s, are detailed drawings of the Cathedral Bridge in Cologne, which is what this is, and the Semmering Viaduct in Austria. The English census for 1891 then finds Edwin in lodgings in Dover, where he was evidently based until his death from bronchitis in 1915, in his 70s. So, rather predictably, there were two cruel twists of fate after Edwin's death. The first was in 1825 at his magnificent St. John's Ealing church. And I mean, I suspect you're probably getting the hang of Edwin's story by now, so you probably can guess what happened. Yep, there you go. On the night of 8th of November 1925, fire broke out, gutting the interior. Really only the walls were left standing. The steeple came crashing down into the chancel and was never replaced. And restorations cost a huge amount at that time, £33,000. However, the good news is that the building today, although it doesn't have its steeple, is still a pretty impressive structure and retains lots of Edwin's exterior features. The second we know about, it was the incendiary bomb damage in 1940 at Highbury and Islington, followed by the destruction of large parts of the structure in the V1 attack of 1944, which left it in this rather terrible state. Let's look at it in happier times. There you go. We'll put that up. The poet John Betjeman was known for having a great affection for the North London Railway, and in particular for these grand stations. He writes in glowing terms of the vast booking halls, the billiard halls, the arcades of shops, the ironwork, and the mansard roofs. He raged at the way that British Rail was stripping the NLR of all its glory, finding it easier and cheaper to demolish rather than repair the vast echoing and decaying stations after the war. God save the old North London was Betjeman's famous rallying cry, but it went unheard. Happily, he was more successful with St Pancras, which showed really well what the regeneration of Victorian railway infrastructure can achieve. But of course, this was too late for Highbury and Islington and many other stations on the NLR. The 60s was a different age with different thinking and different constraints. And all that's left of Edwin's masterpiece now is that small part of the old facade tucked in next to the entrance of the tube station, which many of you will know. Edwin is buried in St Mary's churchyard, a peaceful place below Dover Castle, and his headstone reads, Edwin Henry Horne, formerly an architect of Broad Street, and his remaining buildings are his legacy. Here is a timeline of Edwin's life. Again, I won't go through this, but it does just show how much he accomplished in his 20s and early 30s, which is really an incredibly early age. And hopefully we'll put this on the website. So thank you very much, Jann, for a great piece of research on Edwin's story. After he's left the limelight, and for helping to protect his legacy. So let's move on to our final speaker and session this evening. I've been talking an awful lot this evening, so you'll be delighted, I suspect. So if you're on board with me, then Mike Ashworth is just the sort of perfect antidote, because he has a whole lot of interesting things to tell you about, to bring the story up to date. And Mike, we were going to try and swap screens. Do you want to do that, or do you want to try and share your screen?
If you switch yours off.
If I switch mine off, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? So swap share. Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
Now, you should hopefully see the screen. And hopefully
Yes.
you can all hear me. I think that's probably the main thing. Some of you may be able to see me.
Yeah.
Well, Good evening, everybody, and I'm speaking to you tonight quite some distance from Highbury and Islington station. Actually, I'm up in the Yorkshire Dales. So I was slightly surprised when Richard said, would you like to come back, so to speak, to London to speak about Highbury and Islington station? And I suppose I should say a little bit more about actually why it was of such interest to me for so long. I was, as the previous slide said, and this one says indeed, curator at the London Transport Museum from 1991 to 2002, when I transferred unusually over actually to the operational railway to become design and heritage manager of London Underground, which was a fairly remarkable job, as you can all imagine, I'm sure. And I had, suppose, three sort of primary focuses to the job. First and foremost was around the actual design of passenger-facing design, as we called it, the architecture of stations, and also the design of trains as well. And the third major component part was around the conservation and management of our heritage stations. And I'm sure, again, a lot of you know that we've got over 80 listed stations out of 275 or so that we serve at the moment. So it certainly was a very busy job, and a fascinating job, it has to be said. I mentioned listed stations. It's also worth remembering, of course, that London Underground, nearly every station on the Underground actually has some heritage feature, some railway heritage feature, which we've laboriously listed over time and developed standards to help protect and preserve. And here you can see, of course, the really fine board and tile motifs that you find on the Victoria Line platforms at Highbury and Islington. And it just goes to show that even in the most unlikely places, he says, talking about Highbury and Islington, there is indeed something worth looking at and worth treasuring. And that we really saw that as part of our job. So moving on, of course, to the architectural gem that is Highbury and Islington Station. It is not one of our best, is it? It has to be said. And I can well remember that in our list of suck your teeth stations, Highbury and Islington featured quite highly in many respects, along with places like Old Street. But that's, you know, not to say the fact it's a busy station. It operates. The staff do an incredible job of making sure you can all travel around safely and conveniently. But it has to be said that this is not our finest hour, and I shall be coming back to talk a little bit more about this building as we move through the presentation. And I should say I hope to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. I've been slightly hamstrung by the fact, of course, for the last year I've been unable to do any serious research. I now know precisely what files to look at, particularly in the development of the Victoria Line. And I'm hoping that by the end of this summer, I'll have been able to go to TfL's archives and its PRO@Q and to get a little bit more of the actual story, because what I'm hoping to look for is why London Underground is at Highbury and Islington, what happened to those buildings between 1966-68, why we ended up with the temporary structure that you see today. And I suppose in many respects what I'm going to be showing you, talking to you about tonight, are sort of, if you like, sort of outline ideas of the process and decision making that I think happened at the time. But I think first of all we need to put this station into context and how and why London Underground ended up here. And Richard, of course, has already hinted at the fact. The first tube station in this vicinity, of course, was the Highbury station of the Great Northern and City Railway, which opened in 1904 and which became part of London Transport, I should say, in 1933. At the time, it was being actually run by the Metropolitan Railway. And of course, in the New Works programme of 1935 to 1940, this part of the Northern Line actually would have been part of a really spectacular development into North London that, of course, sadly was curtailed and indeed abandoned almost in its totality in the years of post-war austerity. But it's back to the 1930s we need to go to start thinking about actually the next part of the story of what happened to Highbury and Islington, and that's around the infamous Route C. Around 1936-37, with the New Works programme underway, London Transport started to look at the next sequence of investment options for what I suspect would have been the second New Works programme from 1940 to 1950. And one of the most important areas of coverage that the Underground didn't have was North East London. And that's partially to do with railway politics at the turn of the 20th century when the Yerkes tubes were being built. And there was a real pressing need the Underground saw for various schemes to try and, first of all, capture interchanges with existing mainline railways, but also to start relieving the pressure on the 1932-33 extension of the Piccadilly line north of Finsbury Park, which had proved to be extremely popular and was causing some serious issues south of Finsbury Park towards King's Cross. Now, I won't go into the really gory details tonight of the wartime plans, the County of London plans, for example, on railways. But suffice to say that by the time London Transport became part of the British Transport Commission in 1948, when it was nationalised, things had started to gel around this route running from Victoria through central London and up into northeast London. Still a degree of variability. And just one thing I will draw your attention to is that you can see 1950, the idea was to run Route C as it would become the Victoria line in public in 1955, non-stop from King's Cross to Finsbury Park. So you can see quite clearly here, it actually doesn't go to Highbury and Islington station. I mean, we need to have a quick little look at actually what was to cause the change. And it's largely to do around the decisions of interchange with the Great Northern City line at Finsbury Park. And certainly by 1955, Route C had been set in stone, so to speak, with the interchange with the Great Northern City line at Highbury and Islington that you can see there in those proposals. The sketch map issued from the 1950s shows really the route almost in its final form. Of course, tonight is not the night to discuss the history of the Victoria line south of Victoria, because it don't go to Wimbledon. It was, of course, eventually to go to Brixton. But to look a little bit more closely at the station we're discussing tonight, Highbury and Islington, let's just sort of put this on the map, so to speak, to give ourselves an idea of where we are. And this is an extract from the 1954 Ordnance Survey large-scale maps, which I've copied from the National Library of Scotland. And it shows you quite clearly on the map there on the left, the position of the mainline railway station, Highbury and Islington. What looks like a telephone kiosk box on the other side, of course, is in fact Highbury and Islington London Transport Executive Station. And you can see quite clearly around the site the impact of the wartime bombings, the ruins in the forecourt, the ruins to the east side of the Cock Tavern there, and the now vacant land that would become, of course, the gyratory system in the mid-1950s. And I'd like to just draw your attention on the highlight of that map there is that site bounded there, the White Swan, the post office, and the corner block to Highbury and Islington Station, which was latterly Boots the Chemist. And we shall come back to have a little look at that in a minute. I thought you'd just be interested as well to see this 1935 London Midland Scottish Railway plan showing the North London railway station in hazy detail, I have to say. I'm sorry about that. But of course, what it does show quite clearly, apart from the long lost extensive freight and goods capacity of this station, is it does show where the tracks run out under Highbury Corner. And that's quite an important feature of this station. The bridge decks that the booking office, the roadway, the shops, and then Holloway Road and Upper Street it sits on, right on the corner of Highbury Place, means that there are some exceptionally large spans of railway there. So in fact, actually an awful lot of this station is effectively on bridge deck, and there's very little in the way of solid ground. But to move back to London Transport, one of the key factors was the interchange with the Northern City line. And this is one of a sequence of stations where London Transport involved themselves in some really quite clever engineering to ensure that the platform interchanges were north to north, south to south. So parallel flanking platforms were to be built for the Victoria line. And here, as at a couple of other stations further south, and indeed at Finsbury Park, they chose to route the Victoria line through one of the existing Northern City line tunnels and construct two new tunnels for the Victoria line services northbound, and the diverted Northern City line, as you can see, are northbound as well. And it is to be thankful that the decision was made in the 1950s to build the new diverted Northern City line to mainline gauge. Otherwise, reintroducing British rail services in the 1970s might have been slightly more problematic. One tiny narrow bit of tunnel running through Highbury and Islington station. But this is what was constructed, and the construction phases, as we can see here, started in earnest after 1962. One of the stories of the Victoria Line in many respects, of course, is its lengthy gestation. It's largely down, I suspect, to not only post-war utility and costs, but also there was always a constant complaint that as part of the nationalised British Transport Commission, London Transport got a slightly raw deal when it came to financing and certainly to capital investment. When you think mid-50s, London Transport was vying against British Railways modernisation programmes, for example, in terms of modernising the national rail network. But in 1962, the BTC was abolished, and London Transport became a freestanding executive under the direct control of the Ministry of Transport. And I suspect that the funding for the Victoria Line was a sort of welcome present to the new London Transport, but the planning was so far advanced that in fact construction of the new railway was able to start off fairly quickly. And this appalling sketch, my apologies, is an attempt to sort of show schematically the running lines in blue of the Victoria Line and red of the Northern City Line. And one of the interesting factors, I suspect, about why did London Transport end up effectively in the forecourt of Highbury and Islington mainline station is to do, first of all, with the spatial geometry of the fact that as soon as you've made a decision that you want parallel running, this is actually the layout that the trains themselves and the platforms will take. Secondly was the decision to use the lift shaft. It's important to remember, of course, that the Great Northern and City Line station was a lift operation station, to use the lower lift shafts as the starting point for potential escalators to enable, first of all, street level interchange with increased capacity for the new Victoria Line. Also, I think to a third way, we'll talk about this a little bit more, interchange with the North London mainline services at this point. But effectively, the spatial geometry of this site is relatively fixed once you've made this sequence of decisions, and which we'll see what the impact of that was on the surface. I managed to find a couple of drawings in some of my files since I left. And this is from a drawing showing the existing and proposed layout from H&I station around 1961. And you can see on the left there, these are the routes up from the Great Northern City Line platforms to the lower lift landings. And you can see just about on the right there that in fact what happened was they pushed through effectively the back of the lift shafts to create the start of the passageways leading up to the actual escalator, the lower escalator landing. And this is really quite tight geometry. It actually has the actual passageways have to start to rise fairly rapidly up over the new Victoria Line northbound running tunnels. So you've got a sort of three-level sandwich in some respects going on. And the lift shafts were converted to a variety of uses, including draft relief. Those of you who regularly use the station will know these blue grills, and they mark the site of actually where the lift entrances were at the lower part of the station. Now, if we take that geometry and move it to the surface, you can see an extract on the left here from that LMS drawing, showing the basic layout of the mainline station there, slightly running to the west. And on the right-hand side, again, apologies for the fuzziness of this, but two things. First of all, the inclination of the escalator shaft means, of course, that it has to rise into solid ground. And that's quite difficult given the road levels of Holloway Road. And equally importantly, the LCC's proposed building line, that large red arrow there shows where the London County Council intended actually the road line to be. So the escalator has to thread its way up into solid ground, being equally aware of where that black dot is, of the fact, of course, that solid ground runs out because of the cuttings of the railway, which is 4-track here, and which the station is rafted over. The one interesting thing from this drawing is you can see that once you get to the top of the escalators, to the circulation area there, one of the original intentions appears to have been to reutilise the existing station booking offices on the ground floor. So one of the great unanswered questions is, was London Underground potentially likely to reuse the ground floor of the existing mainline station. Obviously, as we know, it didn't. It actually set to, in some way, working with British Rail, ended in the demolition of that station building itself. But this is certainly a case for more research. You've seen this photo several times before tonight, so we won't linger too long on it, but suffice to say, this shows the early 1950s, just as work is about to start, I think, on the gyratory system, given the layout of the trolleybus overheads here. But it shows the site of the station and some of the problems with it. This is a photo by B. Page showing the demolition of the ruins of the Cock Tavern in around 1956. And in some respects, that's no great surprise that buildings such as this survived in this condition for a decade after the war, and building took so long. You know, there's innumerable examples of damaged buildings. Austerity Britain, difficult to find the steelwork, for example, for reconstruction, and building licenses were really quite difficult to obtain. So a 10-year difference, first of all, in reconstruction, as we see here at the Cock Tavern, and the continued use of the station is actually not rare. And the lower photo here shows around 1960, the new Cock Tavern, you can see there. And you can also see, of course, that the front facade of the building itself is still in use. And the first floor, which was the billiard room, is a furniture depository. So the building's been patched up at the front for reuse with a new roof. And again, this is a photo taken from the rear of the station, from the actual North London lines. And you can see the condition that the building was in. And then the British Railways, were at this time really under, a remarkable amount of cost. They had a lot of these buildings, slightly over large, really, for the use that they now found them with, rather seriously damaged from the war. And many of these buildings, of course, were demolished, and the North London Railway was particularly quite hard hit. But pretty certain I've seen evidence even from the mid-1940s, the LMS railway before nationalisation, were looking at some form of sectional buildings, for example, to actually reconstruct some of these old North London Railway stations. So demolition was, I suspect, possibly always on the cards. A couple of photos showing London Transport Archives, showing progress on the Victoria line. The one on the left shows the demolition site left by the demolition of the post office and Boots the chemist on the northwest corner of the site. And you can just see the range of buildings on the other side of Holloway Road there. And this shows the start of excavations for the escalator machine room at ground level. And the wall covered by scaffolding is the gable wall that you can still see to this day. On the other side, you can see, interestingly enough, that two of the staircases down, I suspect, to the northwestern platforms have already been removed as part of the work, the adjacent work for the London Transport Station. It's also worth remembering by 1965 that although the Broad Street electric services were to continue, Beeching had proposed removal of the rest of the North London Railway routes. So the interchange at this point, I think, was seen really as a tertiary issue as part of the reconstruction. And a couple more photos here, just looking, this is taken, the shovel is resting on the base of the upper escalator machine room chamber, and the timber blocks show effectively what would become the modern floor line. And the other shot is looking down into that space. You may just be able to see there, to the right of the second photo, you can just start to see the rebars bending down to show the inclination actually into the escalator shaft itself. So they're shoehorning this escalator into this available space, which has the added advantage, of course, of being owned by another nationalised authority at the time, which I think is possibly another reason why it was utilised. Their temporary station, this is a photo showing the ticket office just after opening in 1968, a lot of timber panelling looking slightly more park. I suppose it's apposite to say, why did London Transport just build a temporary facility? It's actually slightly unusual for the Underground to do that. If you move up the line to Black Horse Road, which wasn't a direct interchange, but nevertheless, of course, was adjacent to another BR station, we built really quite a substantial building, Black Horse Road. So you could say, why didn't Highbury and Islington get the same treatment in that respect? And I think, thinking about it, there are several reasons. Now, this is incredibly appalling, grainy photo, and my apologies for that. But what this shows, of course, is Ringway 1. And it's worth remembering that during the construction phase, the Victoria Line at Highbury and Islington, which is really 1964 to 1968, is the high watermark of the GLC's proposals to build a motorway box in London. And as you can see, I hope here, Ringway 1 would have slammed through Highbury Corner, just to the south side of the railway tracks. And like all illustrations such as this, of course, it's even worse. We'll go back to this one. You know, it's very easy to draw or build models of something on this scale. There's less attention to detail in terms of actually how you practically develop it. What you can see there, though, of course, at the top there, is that the existing Highbury and Islington station appears to hang on in. I think it's highly unlikely that the station or the bridge decks would have survived having a motorway built next to them. It's also the case that that new building line we saw for the roadways in the LCC plans earlier on would have substantially pushed the station further across on a new deck. So I have a suspicion that, as well as blight in terms of actually a rather dilapidated station that was no longer fit for purpose and therefore easily demolished, with potentially LT's connivance, this probably introduced a degree of planning blight to this site that was to linger really for half a century, in that once you'd made the decision to build a temporary office with the post office in front of it, that has rather stuck. And that's the situation we certainly found ourselves in when we started to look at this station in around 2002 to 2005. It's fair to say we don't like the temporary station as much as anybody else did. And our then managing director, Tim O'Toole, regarded Highbury and Islington really as quite a keynote station. We were already on the verge of looking at integrating, of course, Silverlink into London Overground, as it was to become. And also passenger figures at this station were rising quite dramatically. You know, the Victoria Line, like the rest of the Underground, had become immeasurably more popular. We were about to introduce new trains and new signalling on the Victoria Line, so overcrowding at H&I station was becoming a serious issue. And we did start to look at potential new construction on this site. But a couple of things that I think are worth remembering. First and foremost, this is actually a site not owned by one person. London Underground has certain responsibilities. London Overground has certain responsibilities now. And Network Rail, who actually technically own the infrastructure, including the bridge decks, make for redevelopment complex. Not impossible, but complex. And it's also worth remembering that we were at the time slightly concerned about the loading of those bridge decks. And therefore we proposed really quite a lightweight structure, straddling the existing, hopefully the existing bridge decks. This is purely, in some respects, got no further than these potential architectural sketches. But when the sums started to come back, the issues around the bridge deck meant that to make this site effectively work financially within TfL's budget, you'd either need to redeck or indeed extend the deck, which over a 4-track railway is actually enormously difficult and expensive. And of course, one way of getting your money back is to build higher. And in highly informal discussions and general feelings was that the idea of a high level building on this site would probably not be met with particular enthusiasm in the locality. And for a variety of reasons, this series of proposals stalled. Other people have had a go. 2014, the glass brick concept, again, looking at something that's really quite lightweight, but attempting to bring some, if you like, sense of scale back to the facades of the station. This was wholly a private individual who came up with this idea of actually recreating in this form the station. But this, again, was wholly unofficial and never feasibly considered by London Underground. But just to sort of bring the story to a close, many of you, of course, will have remembered the works after the demolition of the post office that necessitated the reconstruction of the bridge decks that you see here. And I've introduced this photo for a couple of reasons. One of which is just to show you the scale of the overdecking. But if you look towards the back of that picture there, you can see actually the very shallow depth that the ticket office sits on. One fascinating thing is the surviving pillar or pilaster to the left, the famous, almost relic-like, of course, survivor of the original station. I really do need to see some drawings, because that doesn't look actually to be sitting on the retaining walls. It actually looks to be sitting on the deck itself, which raises some interesting discussions about the actual construction of the station and the Cock Tavern and any subsequent rebuilding. But you'll see really the complexities in many respects of this site. I did try to do something with this station, I'll be quite honest. One of the problems was that we had two separate individual projects that drove changes to the station, and we could never get them to add up. The first was the exit gate programme, which of course was largely driven by station congestion and also by funding of Section 106 money from the Arsenal development, when it became pretty obvious Holloway Road, of course, is not exactly compatible with match crowds, that this station actually will become quite important in terms of Arsenal home matches. And that led to the construction of the separate exit gates. And of course, there was then the TfL overground work, which was to enhance the back of the station to allow, again, more passenger space and interchanges as the overground East London line came back into use with its re-extension, of course, up from Shoreditch through to Highbury and Islington. And just to give you an idea of how difficult financing, you will notice that we kicked up a lot of stink and insisted that the safety railings on the new section of the exit gate should basically attempt to be architecturally designed, and we got proper sloping ones. There were no funds to replace the keep railings to the station entrance. So you end up with this mismatch, and I must admit I'm never very happy when banners get added to things like that. And it gives you a case of the complexity of trying to manage piecemeal alterations to stations such as this. We did make one final attempt to actually find funding, possibly aided by the redevelopment of the Northwest Square that you see there, the gable wall square, to actually introduce almost like a rain screen cladding to this station to hide it. Simple as that, to try and give it some, at the end of the day, to give it a facade that at least ties together and at least shows you much more clearly and politely where the entrance and exit is. But again, my colleagues in TfL await funding decisions. At the moment, pre-pandemic, I suspect that's going to be very difficult to prove. But nevertheless, it is acknowledged that this is not our finest hour. And one final thing before I switch off and switch you all off, of course, there have equally been proposals looking at step-free access to this station, which are centred around the original 1904 station. Quite complex in many respects because of the amount of equipment that now sit in those two lift shafts and the fact that those lift shafts don't actually go to platform level. But nevertheless, some feasibility I know has been looked at into possibly redeveloping around the station facade with a building on top, which is what many of these early 20th century stations were designed to do, and to try and enable some form of redevelopment at least one half of this station, even if it is the one that we abandoned in 1968. But thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back over to Richard now. As I say, these are very preliminary thoughts. More research certainly is needed. And I know a lot of other people have spent a lot more time than me looking at this station in the past. But I hope that's given you an idea of why we are where we are. And Richard, I will now hand over to you.
Mike, thank you so much. That was great. And I'm sure lots of people will have been really fascinated to hear that. You know, it's a complicated and you know, lots of different institutions involved. Finance is difficult. I think lots of us are slightly terrified by that, having seen that that bridge deck. But I mean, is it your? Sorry, I should have said we are sort of up to 8:30. I think we can carry on for a bit longer, but I appreciate people will probably need to leave. So I'll just do some thank yous in a second, and then maybe, if you don't mind, Mike, we could do a bit of Q&A if people to type questions into the chat. So please do that, and we can either get back to you or we can post things on the website. I was just going to see if I can share my screen again. So look, just a few things I want to say by way of conclusion. So just a few things to show you. Sorry, I'm just around the wrong place on the slides. We'll get there. Yeah, let me just remind you, you can get copies of Jane's brilliant prints from us on eBay. She's also got her work here. We'll try to send some links around to that. Do sign up. I mean, these two historical societies have been incredibly useful and are really insightful. North London Railway Historical Society and also the Islington Archaeological and History Society, if you're interested in local history or indeed railway history. Keep in touch with the campaign. Our website is at highburyandislington.net, and we're also on Twitter and Facebook. Mike's details are here. I think if people want to, we can put these on the website, and I'm also on Twitter as well, Richard Price 101 and Richard Price 500, depending on whether you want me for work or culture. And Mike is Mike Ashworth 12, and is also, he has a great site on Flickr as well, which is worth looking at. I just wanted to conclude by saying thank you very much indeed to Jann and Mike, to Neil Bowdler, especially for having set this up in the first place, Jim Connor and Barry Page, for responding encouragingly to multiple and frankly increasingly obscure requests, not least on the picture. And thanks to all of you for joining this evening and really keeping the memory of both what the station was and alive, and also thinking about the prospect of improving what we have today. So look, I don't know if there are any questions. Let me just see. I think there may be a few. I certainly have some. This one is for Mike. So, Mike, is there enough height above the NLR tracks for the sort of deck that would be needed now? So not, forgetting 1870 standards, but, built over a live railway to support that sort of heavy, an original, genuine replica of the station.
I think obviously it's fascinating to look at the original Victorian engineering and realise just how good they were at constructing this sort of infrastructure with the technology to hand. Obviously, on one hand, nowadays the standards are much higher. Equally, arguably, technology in terms of building technology is much more advanced. I think the main thing that we gave, and it's worth remembering, what is there is safe for purpose, without a doubt. I think the important thing is the more we looked at the site, and my structural engineers certainly gave us the sort of advice, was that it would have to be reconstructed for any form of major construction. It wouldn't matter if you put the original building back or you put a new building back. You would actually need to deck it out. Now, obviously, of course, the underside of your deck now depends on forms of electrification that you use, and various clearance. But nevertheless, I think the two things that came out in our sort of 2005-2007 discussions when Tim O'Toole was our MD was not only was there the complexity of rebuilding the existing deck, and it's in two halves, as you can see. There's the station building deck and there's the road and forecourt deck, which is the one that's been replaced by TfL Road. But to do that, and also consequently, if you wanted to extend the decking over the open platforms to the west, the south and the west of the station, would be enormously complex. Some of you, you may remember a few years ago, the Network Rail Tesco incident on the Chiltern lines. Attempting to put an existing railway into some form of tunnel. It's eminently doable, but it's very costly, very time consuming. And it would require an immense amount of fundamental work around reimagining the site and reconditioning the site to enable any form of serious construction to go onto these bridge decks. And I think that sooner or later will have to be addressed one way or the other. I'm not a structural engineer. It's sound for purpose as it is now in terms of what we do with it. But if you wanted to build anything more substantial, without a doubt, there will be some significant engineering works involved.
Yeah, so this is not, I've heard people saying, well, what about the air rights and all of that? It's not really an air rights situation, is it? Simply because of the engineering environment, or could it be?
It is, in some respects, it's an absolutely clear air rights issue. As I say, it's slightly more complex in that although London Underground obviously own a substantial amount of the infrastructure here, the bridge deck and the actual mainline railway, of course, is still part of Network Rail. Yeah. So any form of, it would be effectively a tripartite, at least you would have London Underground in terms of obviously continuing to operate the station while works took place. Overground, obviously that's a separate franchise and run that. Network Rail in terms, of course, of the impact actually on their structures and the fact who will carry out the work. You also then, of course, got Islington Council and local residents to take into the mix as well in terms of what they would want to see on this site. So I think more than anything about the fact, the air rights are there and perfectly possible to develop them. The complexity and cost of that is the thing that appears to have eluded everybody so far. And therefore, I think that's the reason why, 50, nearly 60 years further on, this temporary station is still being used at Highbury and Islington. Yeah.
Did you have a sense of, on that deck was remarkable, do you have a sense of what it would actually take, or do you think we need?
As I say, I'm not a structural engineer or engineer. Obviously, we just took advice. In discussions within London Underground. There's just a realization that at the end of the day, it's a slender floor margin. I think is what I'm putting it. Even putting things like the automatic gates in, because obviously we have to feed power to automatic ticket gates. So we have lots of floor conditions on the Underground in terms of actually lack of depth within floor spaces. This isn't as bad as the famous incident at West Hampstead, where we dropped the ticket hall ceiling one day and we could see into the flat upstairs through the floorboards. These are quite elderly, quite often shallow constructions. So even putting modern equipment in has to be thought through to ensure that you are doing it safely and not likely to impact on any existing infrastructure, and in this case, the operation of the mainline railway beneath. So, it's perfectly fit for what it's doing. No problem at all with that. It would be nice to replace it. I'm sure everybody would agree with that. It's just obviously, at this moment in time, there's no imperative to replace it. If you wanted to redevelop the site, which is absolutely fundamentally be a lovely thing to do, if I was still with London Underground, I'd love to put a new station there, be it a replica of the old one or a nice brand new one. But the reality is that until such time there's a requirement to do it, funding packages are put in place that effectively make any work on this station site stack up. I think that's one of the reasons why you've got this sort of long, drawn-out period between potential reconstruction around 1968 and now. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So the blight, lack of funding. Actually, in a pandemic, we're in a slightly odd position now, aren't we? Because there's a risk that with lots of indebtedness, you end up with just less investment being available. But at the same time, the government is very, very keen to spend on all sorts of things investment wise. So less so in London, it seems. Can I just that's not a political point, just to emphasize, a couple of questions and points and a question. Are there any plans to have an exhibition at the station itself? There is actually, if you look, if you go into the entrance and go to the left, there's a series of display boards run by the staff, which are worth having a look at. We're also going to try and, if we can, assemble some of the material we've presented this evening into a booklet of some sort, so that, because we're keen to help people across the whole of Islington to understand what was there and the historical sort of context. Because, you walk past these places every day and you're puzzled, but you don't always think, well, why is it like that? And this really kind of helps to explain that. Martin Bloomfield has put something in the chat, which you do have a look at. If anyone's interested in the men and women who worked on the NLR, please take a look at www.railmen-nlr.org.uk, which is a database of over 8,500 people who worked on the railway. So do take a look at that. And I know his father put a heck of a lot of work into that, and it's a really neat piece of, especially if you're interested in local history or you have family here and people who might have worked on the railway, that's worth a look. A question from Paul Convery, which is sort of an evolution of the question that the discussion we were just having, Mike. So he put, Islington Council since 2013 has earmarked the entire railway corridor from Highbury and Islington to Liverpool Road as a development site. So the decking question. Well, this is extended decking. So is it realistic to do that sort of decking over a live railway, 4 tracks wide? Well, 4 tracks and a bit, in fact, because it's wider in some places. Is that a realistic prospect? Paul's asking, which is a really, really good question.
Anything is possible with money, as they say, depending, as say, the one thing, the entirely informal discussions we had back in 2005, 2007, was that in the world we live in at the moment, to fund that type of decking out of a length of railway to that extent would require very significantly dense development. It's a great. It's not ideal. If you look back to the motorway programme, the M25 tunnels through Waltham Abbey, Waltham Cross, which has a park over it. How lovely that must be. If you can do that, so anything is possible, anything's plausible with money. It is just that issue, I think, here about bringing together all the parties to enable a development that works for each of the stakeholders. And he says, thankfully, I'm now sitting in the Yorkshire Dales, not having to get quite so involved in these discussions in terms of TfL. Obviously, my colleagues in TfL, the people who are still beavering away, keeping your transport system going and developing it and doing a remarkable job of that, maybe looking at schemes working with Islington Council. I'm 4 years out of the job now, but anything's possible. But it would be really quite an undertaking to do that sort of level of work on that bill.
And I guess the other question is what's the demand going to be like? Islington obviously is a very high property value location for business rents and residential rents. But what's the demand going to be? How quickly is that all going to pick up after the pandemic, and what kind of thing is going to pay in that space, which is as big a problem as the issue of is it worth cracking the problem of decking over the space. But I think Paul, I'm right in saying that that is still the sort of council position in terms of development zoning. One thing we should probably just be really, really clear about is that, since people have raised it, that the deck is safe for pedestrians. And as Sophie's pointed out, said she'll never feel safe walking in the ticket. Well, again, it's fine. Okay, it's probably if you're going to build a 3-story building, Eric, probably don't do that. Walking through it on your way to get to the Victoria Line, it's okay. But do you want to say, Mike? I think that's right, isn't it?
The station is perfectly safe.
Perfectly safe, exactly.
Operation and engineering at the moment. It is really important to stress. It's just if we ever started to consider reconstructing a replica of the station, or to carry out any substantial works to reconstruct the station, without doubting, you'd have to start looking at the floor loadings. So that's one of the reasons why we've always been enormously careful in that respect with what we've done on this site, and continue to do so.
Indeed. Sorry for the noises off. Some freight going past the window. And Barry Edwards makes the point. Arundel Park Square is also extended over the railway, isn't it? Which was paid for by another developer. David Benson, question about information on North London line in the years prior to the ELL extension and photos of the old layout. The best place to look, David, is on the North London Railway Historical Society website. They have all sorts of links. They've got there here somewhere. Lots of things like, no, can you see? You can't see it. This is the annoying thing about fake background, isn't it? You can't actually show anything. Anyway, I was trying to show you their journal, which is very good, but they have all sorts of links there. And we might try and post, we will put some of the links on our website as well, so you can find them easily. But yeah, it's a really interesting railway history as much as anything. Sophie says few, that's good. Right, Martin Lunnon, what was the cord from the North London line under Highbury Fields ever used for? Right, if I open the window, you can hear freight going on it right now, Martin, just about. It's a squeaking freight train going through. So basically it's a freight only line at the moment. Originally it was built as a link from the East Coast Main Line through to the North London line. It was, so basically you think of all those commuter trains that now go through the sort of dive down the tunnel into Moorgate. Those used to go to Broad Street station until it was closed in, when was it closed? Like 86, I think. Yes. So they basically ran under it was a double line, it ran under Highbury Fields, onto the North London line and round to Broad Street. Some mainline trains, you know, sort of more substantial longer distance services used to run through there as well. After 86, when the Moorgate line sort of opened properly and British Rail took that over, the line here was singled and it was electrified. And it's got, you know, there's as anyone will tell you who lives along here, there's a lot of freight that goes over it now, mainly container traffic, some aggregates. They sort of rock the house gently in the evening as you're trying to get to sleep, which is all rather pleasant. There was talk of putting the East London line through there, but the sort of configuration of the lines was too complicated, which is why it's terminating at Highbury and Islington and not Finsbury Park. So I don't think there are any plans to run passenger trains through it. One thing I must tell you, there was one evening when, you know, that we could hear a strange noise coming from the tunnel, and I sort of rushed over to see what it was because it sounded like Armageddon. And it was, and out came the Hogwarts Express. You know, in a sort of bizarre, you know, convergence of fantasy and reality. It was, you know, coming back from filming, quite bizarre. Right. Any other? Oh yeah, thank you, anonymous attendee for the open train times link. I actually don't tell anyone, but occasionally when I'm at work, I sort of keep it open on the screen just so I can see what's going. I can work out what's going past. Great. Look, it's probably the time of the evening where if we were doing this, you know, in the proper way, which would mean we were doing it in one of the rooms at the Union Chapel, we'd all now retire to the bar for, you know, a pint or something. And unfortunately we can't do that, but I've really enjoyed this. I think, you know, Jane, you've done a fantastic job in the illustration. Mike, it was just really fascinating to hear all of that. I think that sort of bit from the sort of, you know, ancient history through the decision making that got us to where we are now and explains what you see, and every time you walk through Highbury and Islington, that's been really fascinating. So, and I know you're looking to do more research on this, so hopefully we can help you with that, and you know, we can do some more, yeah, we can perhaps do another of these in the future. I'm also conscious that Jim Connor from North London Railway Historical Society is planning a book, I think he's writing a book on the stations of the North London line, including Highbury and Islington. So do look out for that as well. And perhaps, Jim, if you fancy doing one of these at some point, you know, it's a good audience and we'd be very, very happy to have you. So look, thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thanks, Mike and Jane, and Jann, of course, in particular. And
thank
we
you
will
as well.
hopefully, you know, do stay in touch. All the best, folks. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.